If you want to learn how to make Ghibli style textures in Substance Painter, the latest course from the 3D coloring book was made for you. I'll leave a link in the description if you want to consider getting the course. Now let's get into this week's video.
Hello everybody, my name is Hunter. I am a 3D environment / prop artist, and in this video I'm going to be doing a quick breakdown in how I've done my most recent stylized environment piece. Now, to be clear, this is not going to be a tutorial video. This is just simply going to be a breakdown of the process that I myself go through when I create an environment such as this. Now, before I get into my own process and breakdown of how I created this specific stylized environment, I really want to make sure that everybody watching this video has a great understanding of the relationship between stylized art and realistic art. Now, this goes for any job that you have in the industry, whether you're a character modeler, environmental artist, a prop artist, an animator, whatever. In order to create a good stylized prop, you need to have a great understanding of realism. Now, you can look through every single person's Artstation page and look at all of their stylized props, and they will all have one thing in common if they're good stylized props, that the creator has a great understanding of what realism is in their art. Now, once you have this better understanding of realism, your stylized works are going to thrive. They're going to get so much better, I promise you. Now, this goes for everybody, whether you're an animator, character modeler, environmental artist, prop artist, whatever. Character modelers, you have to know the right proportions before you start pushing and pulling. Environmental artists, you need to know the way light reacts to certain materials and certain shapes, and the way shadows look, and the way that the camera angle is, and the perspective, and the FOV, and the depth. You have to know how realism works in order to create good stylized art. And the same goes for animators. Animators, you have to know how to make something realistically before you can make it look wacky. And if you don't know what it looks like realistically, it's going to just look wrong. Okay, now that I've explained the important relationship between stylized art and realistic art, we can finally get into my project. Alright, so let's take a look at my environment. First thing I want to make sure to say is that the amazing concept is by Catherine Kotovskia. Check out her Artstation. She has some really great stylized concept that I'm really happy about. I really wouldn't have been able to do this project without her amazing concept. Other than that, this is probably my first uber stylized environment that I've ever done. This is really my first attempt at something this stylized. It took me quite a few weeks to actually get this completely done. I did run into quite a few problems here and there, which I will refer back to later when I go in depth with my process and my breakdown. Now let's get into the actual process and breakdown that I use when I create any asset or environment, with the first step being finding a good concept. Now, I find almost all of my concepts off of Artstation. It's really simple to do. Sometimes I just concept. If I look up anything specific, I'll look that up. Typically, I sort it by a digital 2D medium, so I don't get any 3D props that were made from concepts. But as you can obviously see, there's still going to be a lot of 3D assets here that you don't want when you're looking for concepts. So you can find tons and tons of great concepts and great artists on Artstation, but these are my steps in order to find the best concept for you to model. Now, the very first, most important thing about finding a concept is to make sure that you like the concept. This is something that is extremely important and can make and break not only your model and your environment, but your morale while you're making it. I cannot tell you how many times I have been way through a project, like almost at the end of a project, and I just don't want to do it anymore because the concept was something I just found randomly off the internet with no passion involved in it whatsoever. So please make sure you actually like it so you'll be enthusiastic and passionate the whole time you're creating this asset or environment. So my second main point of finding a concept is to make sure it is actually in your skill level. Again, nothing breaks morale faster than finding a concept, modeling almost everything, and finding one thing that is so incredibly hard to recreate or model. It is infuriating and it just completely drops your motivation and your passion. So please make sure it's actually in your skill level. Take time to look through the concept very, very thoroughly to make sure that you can actually do it. Because you're always going to find something, and I promise you, you will always find something in the concept that you picked that you didn't notice before that is going to be more difficult than you thought. Now, I'm not saying don't challenge yourself, but make sure that when you challenge yourself, it's something that you know that you're able to do, or it's just going to look bad and you're just going to lose your passion and morale way far in the project. Now, this is probably the biggest thing I think of after finding a concept. And it's something that artists typically gloss over when looking over the concept. Your job as the artist is not only to do justice to the original concept, but to improve upon it as well. Now, don't get crazy, obviously. If you're modeling something off of concept, don't change the concept so drastically that the concept creator will get angry at you. And that's not what I'm saying whatsoever. I'm saying that in certain concepts you will find something just doesn't make sense. So it's your job to also improve upon the concept that you have found. Alright, so after I find my perfect concept, I go ahead and add my concept into Maya. So the way you're going to want to do that is go to View, go to Image Plane, and go to Import Image. Now you're going to want to make sure that the image is in your Source Images folder in your project window so that Maya always knows where that image is going to be and never loses it. It's really bad because sometimes you open Maya and then all your pictures are gone and you don't know where they are. So make sure that your pictures are in your project window under Source Images in that folder. Now after I've added that into Maya, it's going to immediately put it in whatever camera angle you're in. So if you want to have an orthographic view, you look through an orthographic camera, but right now I only want it in a perspective view. So after I get it in the perspective view, I'm immediately going to put it into a layer so I can easily turn it on and off and make it a reference so I don't click on it when I'm trying to find something else. Now, right now I want to click on it because I'm trying to show you how to make the image how I make it. It's very simple. All you do is select the image, go to alpha gain in the attribute editor, and right here you can up its transparency or lower its transparency in case you need to see through it. So these are the settings that I usually use while I'm blocking it out. Alright, so after I make sure to import my concept into Maya and make sure I can do whatever I want with it, this is the point where I usually start focusing on the camera and specifically how the camera reacts in the actual concept itself. So we can see in this concept that we have here, you can see all of these lines from the mountains to the tops of the house to even the way the rocks are pointing. They all point to the very center of the actual concept. Now this is very important. This is very important because if you don't get the right FOV and you don't get the right perspective on your camera, it's going to look much different than your concept and it's going to look very wrong. Now what we're going to do is we're just going to select our camera, go back to the layer editor and channel box, and the only thing that I usually touch when focusing on the camera is the focal length. Now the focal length is extremely important. You can see even just by doubling the focal length it changes everything. Now you might be thinking, well, you just zoomed in a little bit. No, that's not actually what focal length does, but because we can see that even when I zoom out, that's not what we had it as before. So you're going to want to mess with this very much. First of all, you're going to mess with actually how you place the camera just like this. And remember, you're controlling the camera in Maya when you're just moving around. You're actually controlling a perspective camera. So keep that in mind that you have a camera on hand at all times when you're doing this. So if you want to make any minor adjustments, you can do it just by panning the camera or anything like that. And this is what I usually do. Some people actually create cameras just to make sure that they always have that camera set up and they can just select that view whenever they want to. But the way I like to do it is a little different. So like I said, I select the camera, make sure my focal length is what I want it to be. And I usually measure this based off of one square that I can find somewhere in the concept. So we can actually see this line right here that goes across the length of this house and one that goes across the width of the house. So what I usually do is I put my camera in a position to where I can easily see a cube that I have created along these lines, and I messed with the zoom of the camera and the focal length of the camera for a very long time until I can get this cube to match exactly that line. And once I match that, I also try to see if it matches everything else in my scene, and once it does, then I can start blocking out the rest of the scene. Now, obviously, once you have this camera and you mess it up, you might be thinking, oh no, I'm never going to get my camera back in that position ever again. Well, there's something very easy that you can do about that. When you find the exact camera angle and you find the exact camera focal length and everything's perfect with your camera, very quickly go to View, Bookmarks, Edit Bookmarks, New Bookmark, name it, and add it to the shelf. And once it's added to the shelf, it'll look something like this. And every time you move your camera, no matter what it is, you can do anything with the camera, mess with the settings, no matter what, you can always click this button back on the shelf and it will always bring you back to your original bookmark position. Now, obviously, I've tried it a couple different times to get it's perfect. And this is what I ended up finding was the perfect camera edit to match this concept perfectly. And don't take this step very lightly, because you need to get this really, really, really well matched to the concept in order to make it look good. This takes me usually about a couple of hours to actually make sure that I can get the camera angle and perspective perfect before I move on with anything else. So after I fixed my camera to match my concept, my third and next step is going to be using primitive blocking. Now, if you've done your camera settings right, your primitive blocking should match the concept really, really, really well. And again, these are only just extremely, extremely basic shapes to match the layout and the perspective, just to get a really, really good feel of how everything's going to be laid out. Now, from this, you should be able to get multiple things. First of all, does it even look right? I use something I like to say, I use something I call a a cam key, because the concept I have isn't actually a big enough area for me to model everything on the outsides. So what I did is I actually just made a plane, cut out a hole, and then made the material black for this, which makes my layout much, much easier to do. So if you want to make a cam key for your concept, I highly suggest doing it like this. So yeah, as you can see, this is just my basic primitive block out, only just extremely, extremely basic shapes. Even these mountains are just really, really low poly meshes that I use to make sure that everything lays out perfectly and looks like where it's supposed to be. Now, after I set out my primitive block out and I make sure everything looks generally where it's supposed to be and the layout looks fine and the perspective is still fine as well, sometimes I do this and sometimes I don't. But I usually like to take all my primitives, so everything here, even the cam key and the camera, and I like to import it in whatever you're rendering it in. If you're rendering it in here, that's fine. I rendered this specifically in Unreal, so again, this is completely optional, but it does help. What I like to do is I like to put the primitives and I import them into your renderer or game engine and just do some really, really simple basic lighting just to see how the lighting reacts to that. Yeah, so again, this is completely optional. Sometimes I do it, sometimes I don't. But this will let you have a decent understanding of how lighting interacts with the environment and the basic shapes. So this is a good point that I found when I did this originally that some of the lighting was being really weird, and it let me know of a problem very early that I learned about the lighting with this, is that it was going to be very funky, weird lighting. I ended up having to create many different lights and use lighting channels. I'm going to get back on that later, but just to let you know that if you want to, and I recommend that you do, lighting tests with your primitives just to see if you can catch any complications early and to see how it looks with the lighting very early on. Alright, so usually my next step after blocking whether I have lighted it in Unreal or not is to just go ahead and start doing the low poly models. So here are my low poly models. Now this is kind of some of the behind the scenes aspects of this. You can kind of see behind here that things look very interesting, and sometimes they just don't look right. But for the camera perspective, it makes it look a lot more believable and a lot more stylized. And if anything that I've learned while doing stylized assets and props and full environments is that you really need to push the stylization on some of these parts. Looking back at this, I really wish I pushed the stylization, especially on some of these, smaller props like these barrels. These barrels could absolutely pass for realistic barrels, depending on how you texture them. So you really need to make sure to push past your limits some when you start modeling stylized assets. And I can kind of show this with the house right here. First of all, house shingles don't look like this, right? House shingles are typically all uniform and they're all the same size, and they all look the same. So I really tried to push past that with trying to make a lot of these shingles irregular. And even this whole house, houses don't have this big giant dip, and this wooden beam doesn't just magically grow when it goes to the top of the house. That's just something that you can see very obviously that makes it stylized. And even just the house itself is kind of laid out weird. You have these two small windows and then these two giant windows in the very top of the house that, being such a small house, looks like this really wouldn't do anything. So you really have to think about this, and also make sure that your concept thinks about it as well, because this also includes improving upon your concept. That if you think your concept isn't doing something right, maybe you can try to do it better in your models. So yeah, I definitely wish I could go back to fix some of these things, but just for later contemplation, just know that when you're making stylized props, you really have to push past your comfort level, and you really have to push past what you think looks acceptable sometimes. And if it helps you, take a break every once in a while, step away and then come back to really make sure that you know what it is that you're modeling, so you can get a very fresh look at it. So yeah, make sure you just really push stylized props. Now, looking back at the low polys, it actually, I actually just recalled that the shingles actually gave me quite the trouble, because not only did they conform to the roof of the house very weird, as you can see they kind of shrink as the closer they get to this tower, but if you can look closely, you can also kind of tell that this is not a flat plane that the house uses. It kind of dips down in the middle right here along this crease, and then comes back up at this corner. So I kind of had to figure out a way to fix that, and the way I did it was actually pretty simple but pretty useful. So what I did is I actually created the shingles on a regular plane, and then what I did is I just grabbed the group with the shingles in the plane, I deformed it using a lattice deformer, and it's as simple as that. And using lattice points are just like using the soft selection tool. Of course, as you can see there, they can make things pretty funky sometimes and make it look really wrong. But it's very simple to control the parameters of this, to control how many lattice points you have. And I basically use something like this to grab each of these lattice points, change the gizmo position to snap to the lattice points, and then actually just snap it to the roof in every single corner. And obviously this is wrong, but I snapped it in every single corner, and then I used these middle deformers to actually get it a little closer to what I wanted. So that was just one of the many problems that I had, and one of the solutions that I found, which is actually pretty useful. So if you ever have this situation, using a lattice deformer is very useful when shingling a roof. So after I make sure my low polys are modeled, I do another quick lighting test in Unreal, and this is the exact same thing I'm doing with the primitives, is just seeing how the light reacts to the smaller details that I have now. So like these shingles, and all these smaller props that I have now, and it's really simple. It's nothing too crazy. It's just another very simple lighting test, and I'll show you that once I get into Unreal later. So after I model all of my low poly models, which you can see here, I usually just take it into UVing and then just straight into high poly detailed modeling. But with this one, I actually did something a little different than what I usually do. Since I was using a game engine instead of a renderer, I kind of tried to test the limits of what we could actually get done with the game engine. So instead of going from low poly UV to high poly, I went from low poly to a medium poly, just a little bit higher than low. And the first thing that you can see from this medium poly right here is that light reacts much better with all of these edges, and this is just simply from beveling them. It took me quite a while to bevel everything the way I wanted to, but in the end it just looks much nicer, and the way the light hits those edges makes that much more of a difference, especially when you render it. Now, from this, I actually UV'd. So let me show you some of the UVs that I've done. They're very basic. These are just some of the barrels that I UV'd. There's really nothing special about UVing any of this stuff. Just the basic rules, hide your seams, you know. And I also started working on the foliage. So as you can see here, all of my foliage is actually just cards that I've made from a couple of different methods. I actually use Substance Painter to texture them, and then to use an alpha card to block out the opacity from here. So again, these medium polys are really not that high at all. You can see they're only around 6,000 just for this wall, which isn't a lot, especially for game engines. A lot of people underestimate game engines now, when game engines can handle so much more than just a tiny environment like this. Overall, I have quite a few tries, but the game engines can really handle that pretty well. Yeah, so going from low poly to medium poly and not worrying about high poly in this situation with a lot of these models, especially since the models from the concept, you can see, don't have a lot of detail in them. You know, you can see a little detail here and there, but you can just work with that in Substance Painter and just use masks and maps to fix that just by yourself, without having to actually focus on a lot of the high poly sculpting. Alright, so after I make my low polys to medium polys and I finish UVing them, I take them into ZBrush to give them a little more details. Now, personally, at the very least, I just like to bring everything into ZBrush to soften the edges a bit to capture better light. That seems to be always a good start for myself. And at the most, especially for smaller props and hero assets, I usually sculpt them majorly, and that is needed for a detailed sculpt like that, where you're only focusing on one specific thing. So in my environment, as you've seen before, I have these two large trees that are in the front of the camera. Now, I didn't want to go crazy with the sculpting of these because they are kind of hidden in the darkness and they are kind of hard to see. So at the very least, I wanted to make sure it had some roughness in the sculpt and to make it a little more interesting. Now, this is a really big tip for anybody sculpting. Don't be afraid to use the tools available to you to actually get you farther ahead and become more efficient. In this industry, speed is absolutely crucial. If you can make something really good, but it takes you 3 days, that's going to be a problem if you can do it in just a couple of hours with some alphas and some different brushes. So what I've done with this here, and I did it very quickly. Let me soften it so I can show you. I have a lot of these brushes and alphas that I find, and you can buy them anywhere really. I like to look at Artstation a lot, and they're just alphas and brushes that you can just drag along any model to just give it some more texture and to make it a little bit more interesting. Again, please don't hesitate to use these tools that are available to you, because it's going to make you so much faster and so much more efficient. Just sacrificing a little bit of your own creativity for speed is absolutely necessary sometimes. Now, like I said, I didn't want to go too crazy on this, so you can still kind of see that it's a little low resolution, and it is only 230,000 points, polys. And obviously, on the back, I didn't have to do any sculpting, because the biggest tip for that is if they're not going to see it, don't do it. There have been plenty of times where I've modeled something for hours and I realized that you're not going to even be able to see it in the scene. So that's just something that you want to keep in mind, especially when you're sculpting, since sculpting does take quite a long time. Alright, so after I finish my high polys in ZBrush, and I make sure all of my high polys are done, UV'd completed, low polys done, all that, I begin texturing. Now before I texture all of my props and my assets, what I like to do first is focus a little bit on my foliage. Now, foliage by itself is its own thing. It doesn't really fit into little assets or props or anything like that, so I like to do foliage all by itself so I don't get confused along the way. So while texturing the foliage, the way I like to start it is when doing the trees, I'm going to start a leaf texture. Now, I'm going to be using leaf cards for this project, so as you can see here, I basically used a pretty simple, it might not look like it, but it is a pretty simple leaf generator. And what that does is I have two outputs here for the first leaf and for the second leaf, and then I also give it opacity maps and normal maps just so I can have all the details. Like I said, this is a pretty simple one. I start with a shape, transform it, warp it to make it have that kind of leaf shape. Then I give it the stem, I give it, you know, some different details here and there. I'm not going to go through all of this because it is a lot, especially when we get into the even bigger, more complicated graphs. But yeah, I'm pretty much just altering shapes to make it look like a basic leaf. And you can see as we have here, that's exactly what I get. I even have those little kind of jagged edges on the edge of the actual leaf. Now from what I do here is I take these opacities and normal maps and the actual outputs, and I can create a lot of crazy things with this. So now let me go to my other graph. Yeah, so this one is much more complicated, but you can get a lot more stuff with it as well. So as you can see here, if I zoom into my 3D view, I can actually create cards like I did for the leaves and just place them wherever I want, but then I can also create materials based off of that. So, you know, this could be like bushes or actual tree leaf blobs that you can put under the tree cards, and that's actually what I did. So I basically took these materials and I added them onto a kind of spheroid shape under the tree leaf cards, and then I put the cards over the top of them, so I didn't have to use as much cards and you couldn't see through the tree as well. You could just see this nice material underneath. And again, this material isn't crazy even though it looks like it. I actually can use this and transform it into a ground material too. You can see I have dirt and pebbles and twigs and things like that. For this one, I didn't really use that, and then I just gave it a color at the end to make it look really nice and to make it look pretty stylized. And the color is really important for stylization, especially when you work in Substance Designer, and also the roughness, as you can see here. So this is a pretty vibrant color, but I wanted to make sure I had spots that are dark and spots that are light inside it all. So that's pretty much how I did all of the foliage for this, whether it be bushes or trees. And like I said, with this you can create some really amazing things. So I'd highly suggest, if you're getting into stylized art, to look into Substance Painter. Even this, I created something along the lines of a sakura blossom, which you can use just like you used in this material right here to kind of place them all around. Alright, so when I actually like to start getting into my stylized asset texturing, I put all of my assets into Substance Painter, and I make sure to bake my normals down from my high polys back down to the low polys, just so I can get those nice details without having to sacrifice any of the polygons and make it less efficient. Now the very first thing I do after that, and not a lot of people do this, is I go to Display Settings, Studio 3, and I change my environment to Studio 3 instead of Panorama, which is the default. So you're going to notice that on Panorama that it looks drastically different than what I have from Studio 3. That's because it's using actual data for the reflection, so it's going to change your colors up quite a bit. So you notice that when I change from Panorama to Studio 3 that I get different colors. These are actually the purest colors that I can get because I'm using no reflection data. There's no color out here that it's reflecting off of, so I can see the pure color of what I'm actually working with. Now after I set up everything in my project like that, I really like to use Bone Stylized to start off as a base for my stylized textures. Now you're going to notice it has a base and a dirt texture immediately inside of it. Now the base texture can be anything you want. Obviously these shingles were kind of a burnt red orange, so I used that, and then I changed the dirt color to what I thought seemed fitting. And obviously after that you want to go into the mask settings and look in the mask editor, look in the dirt generator and look in the levels of the Bone Stylized and tweak it to whatever you need to get it to look the best that you can. So after I do that, I get a really good base, but obviously it looks very vibrant and there's not a lot of diversity in the actual color. So what I do is I add another Bone Stylized and I put a mask on it and pick UV random color as a generator for the entire Bone Stylized folder that I have here. Obviously before that I want to change the base color in the dirt as well. But when you have that done, you're going to start getting these random islands around your UVs. Now obviously since these are shingles, I've UV'd it in a specific way to make sure that I have each shingle is its own island, so that this UV random color can pick random islands in my UVs and starts to add this Bone Stylized copy's effect on it. Right, after I've done that, I wanted to add a little bit more diversity. So what I did is I actually just copied a base from this Bone Stylized and separated it. And then what I start to do, just very lightly, is started to paint in random areas of the shingles where it would match my concept, just to make it a little bit more worn. You can kind of see there what it looks like when it's off and when it's on. It just gives it a little bit better look and makes it not so uniform. And obviously this is very simple. I just use a pure brass material on there because it's going to be very far away and you're not really going to be able to see it. So this is just the basic workflow of how I do my stylized textures. Alright, so after I texture everything and make sure it's all up to my standards, I import everything into Unreal. Now, Unreal is my personal preference of renderer, specifically in game engines. Sometimes I use Unity, but most of the times I use Unreal just because right off the bat when I import everything in, it starts to look nice without me having to do much. Usually I have to take a lot of stuff out the more and more I get into it, but that's just how Unreal is. Unity is the exact opposite way. It starts you with nothing and you have to put everything into it. So whatever your personal preference is, mine is just Unreal. Now, the first thing that I ran into importing, the first problem I ran into was trying to get my camera exactly how it was in Maya in Unreal. I've tried many different ways to do this in Unity and Unreal, and importing the camera almost always never works. So what I did in this project was I actually just made a new camera actor, made sure it was in the exact location as it was in Maya, and make sure, this is the important part, made sure that the field of view was exactly the same. And there are other couple settings that you might have to look at just to make sure you get it perfect, just like you had it in your Maya or Blender file. Now, after I make sure everything is imported and everything looks nice, everything's in the right spot, nothing is out of place, I start to begin to light. Now, the first thing I do in lighting is I actually create a sun sky just to make sure that everything has a general light bouncing off of it. This is also going to give you some global illumination, so you don't have to worry about that. And then after that, this is kind of where things started to get a little tricky. I started with a directional light just to give everything a little more light and to give everything a little more shadow. But you can immediately see that this directional light doesn't actually affect everything in the world. In fact, it only affects everything in the foreground, which is something that I had to play around with a lot to get. So you might see here that I have 3 directional lights, and you can see that as I turn them all on, they all do something a little different. And this is something really special while you're working with concept, because lighting in concept is almost always a little flawed, just because it's not something that you can really put on 2D very well. So when you start to get everything in 3D, you start to notice that a lot of the lighting is impossible in the concept. So this is, again, where you really want to try to focus on fixing the concept and making it better. Now, the way I actually did this was I used lighting channels. So when I click on any object, you can see as you scroll down in their components that you have this lighting drop-down menu. And if you go to the advanced, they like to hide it for some reason, but when you go to the advanced, you can go all the way down and you can see lighting channels. Now you can have a lot of lighting channels, but I just used the first 3 that I have here. So these cattails right here only use lighting channel 2. And you can see that this directional light, if you go to the same place, where is it? If you go to the same place right here in the lighting channel in the directional light, you can also see that this lighting channel only affects channel 2. This goes with everything in my scene. Even these leaves right here, if you look all the way down, this is only affected by channel 1. And you can see my directional lights are also only affecting channel 1 or 0 or 3. So if you go back up, right about here, you can see that this only affects channel 1. The same goes with this directional light. It only affects this specific channel. So what this allows me to do is it allows me to use really specific lighting to get exactly the lighting I want on very specific assets in the entire scene. This also made a bigger problem to whereas these leaves and these leaf cards actually did not want to be affected by the light very well at all. So if we look through this, we can open the materials for the lighting cards, or for the leaf cards, I'm sorry. Okay, so when we look in the leaf material, first of all, my leaf materials are always set up pretty basic: surface, masked, and default lit. Now make sure it's surface and masked. Masked is really important because it's going to allow you to use this opacity mask that you can plug in right here. And I've blurred it a little bit just to get a little more what I like. Now, when you use an opacity mask, you're going to want to make sure that you have dither opacity mask checked so you can get that gradient and it's not just a black and white harsh edge. That's very important, especially when doing foliage. But that wasn't my problem. My problem was that my leaves looked very, very bad when using the lighting. Now, what I did with that is something that I never usually do, and I actually turned two-sided off. And when I turned two-sided off, it gave it this very nice stylized kind of textury look to it instead of what it was before and having dark, harsh black shadows and edges. And I can actually show you very quickly what that looked like, and I'm sure you'll agree with me that this looks much better. So I'm going to turn two-sided back on and I'm going to apply it. It's going to load for a second. And you're going to immediately see just how bad it looks. This took me quite a while to figure out why it looked this bad, and then I figured out that for some reason my two-sided was messing a lot with the lighting and making these very harsh shadows, which wasn't very good looking. So I eventually just turned two-sided off, and it pretty much fixed my problem, and it gave it an even more stylized, kind of toony look to it. So nothing very complicated with my lighting. Like I explained before, I just used a couple of lighting channels to get the light where I wanted it to be, and where the parts that were being messed up, I kind of played around with it until I absolutely got it right. And in my case, this was just turning off the two-sided thing. So after I finished my lighting and my post-processing, I will actually start my post-processing. So I can look at my post-processing volume, and my main volume that I use, or I'm sorry, my main lens that I use, my lens post-processing, is depth of field. Now you can kind of notice when I turn depth blur radius off that the background becomes much less blurred, and I really wanted that edge to be blurred on the top of the mountains, so I used that. The next thing I used just to get the kind of overall look for the post-processing is slope and shoulder. Now when I turn shoulder off, or I'm sorry, when I turn slope off, you can immediately see it becomes much blurrier and all the colors kind of fade into each other. So when I use slope, I turn it all the way to 1 and it makes everything much crisper and much more vibrant, which it gives it that really stylized look. The same goes for shoulder. You might not be able to tell, but when I just used slope, the vibrance was way too much, and I just used shoulder just to bring it down a little bit. So after I've done my lighting and my processing, my post-processing, then we can go on to our next step, which is compositing. Okay, so this is the final step that I take when finishing a project, is the compositing step. Now, this step is extremely important because it can make or break your final result of your project. Now, this is obviously for any touch-ups or anything you need to add or remove that you don't really want to deal with in your renderer. And a lot of times renderers can have errors that you need to fix. Sometimes it's a little too grainy, sometimes, the colors are a little off, so you might want to fix that in compositing. So this is basically what I did in my compositing. A lot of this was just making sure that I fixed everything and added a background. Now, this is a pretty simple background that I just use basic brushes to paint. I actually just used one of these simple brushes. I believe I used this one right here. And then I just slowly started to paint in kind of very fluffy clouds, and I changed a lot of them. So I don't use just one layer, I use a couple different layers of clouds. So the very first thing I wanted to do is just add, just a basic area of where the clouds were going to be at, and kind of turn down the opacity some. And the next thing I wanted to do is just keep on adding layers upon layers of those, and when it starts to hit the edge of certain assets and around these mountains, I want to kind of just make the opacity just a little bit less opaque there, make it a little bit more translucent, so I can get this kind of nice halo around the mountains and the rest of my assets. And of course I used some basic brightness and contrast and hue and saturation things to fix that, or hue and saturation layers to fix that. The next thing I wanted to add was fog. And now in my concept there's a thick heavy fog that kind of made it really hard to see what was behind the actual house, and in Unreal I couldn't really get a desired fog. Now again, this is very simple. I just used basic layers and just painted just some very light gray and white across the areas that I want it to be, and then I just kind of went from there and added more layers and made it less opaque and more opaque in some places. And again, I used some hue and saturation to kind of lighten it up to make it look more like fog. And next thing I did here is I selected the cattails area because you can see here the cattails were very dark for some reason, and I just lightened them up a bit and gave them a little more saturation. And overall, I just kind of gave the whole scene just a little bit more saturation, just so things can pop a little more, because things start to get very faded once I started to look at it in the compositing step. And then again, I just kind of brightened everything and increased the contrast just a little bit to make it really pop and look really stylized. Well, that's pretty much it. That's my entire process slash breakdown of how I created this environment and how I create most of my environments. So please go ahead and check out my Artstation, and go ahead and check out Catherine Kotowska's Artstation. She has some really nice concept over there. I'm sure she'd love to get some more follows. And overall, I'd just like to thank you all for watching this video.